We chart the importance of our literary figures, our political figures, our activists in Florida. And one of those figures was, of course, Marjory Stoneman Douglas. We're lucky enough to have her archive. So what you're going to be seeing tonight is an homage to Marjory, but in many ways, we were able to have this evening because we have these papers that she thought enough to save them and put them aside, and that we are its custodians. She was born on April 7th, 1890 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She moved to Miami to work with her father, Frank Stoneman, who was then the editor of the Miami Herald. As an assistant editor on the paper, Douglas wrote about Miami's social world, but she also composed editorials urging protection and development of Florida's unique regional character in the face of, even then, rapid commercial development. And in 1947, she published The Everglades River of Grass, which quickly became a bestseller, and rightly so. She died in her home in Coconut Grove on May 14th, 1998, at the age of 108.
So a few years ago, Sandra Riley, who's on the stage with us, was in looking at the Marjory Stoneman Douglas papers and said she came across this play and she was really interested in turning it into something and maybe making it a performance. And as a Marjory short story, I thought that would be perfect as something we can do in the Kislak Center. And as we were getting closer to the 75th anniversary of River of Grass, it seemed like the perfect way to honor Marjory to have Sandra and T.L. Brown perform this play. So this is based on the Pineland short story written in 1925, has been adapted by Sandra Riley. So suppose there was a guy, Larry Gibbs, a reporter for a Dade County newspaper, and his boss, Jack Kelly, said he would loan him a car to take Sarah McDevitt to her homestead in South Miami, or to her homestead south of Miami. Sarah had just attended the funeral of her younger son, Joe, who had been hanged for a murder that happened in a party gang bank robbery. She needed someone to take her home since her older son was in prison. Jack Kelly put a month's supply of canned goods in the car for her, and Larry Gibbs agreed to drive her home. They are on their way to Pineland.
I was thankful that the roughness of the road took all my attention, because I had no idea what to say to a woman whose son had just been hanged. She sat like a stone beside me in the front seat of the car. All around us, the white brilliance of the Florida noon poured down upon the uneven road. It was Jack Kelly who told me he would loan me an automobile if I would take Sarah McDevitt home. It was the same Jack Kelly who had turned state's evidence on the party gang and who started the fund to provide Joe McDevitt's body with a decent burial. He made sure that he had a prominent place in the newspaper photographs at the grave, which next morning would assure all Dade County that the party gang, including the McDevitts, was at last broken up, either by being driven from Florida like the father, or doing endless terms in prison camps like George McDevitt, or like Joe, made safe for Southern progress with a stretcher rope, a pine coffin, and a few feet of Florida marl. Go on now, Larry Gibbs. There's a story in Sarah McDevitt yet. Both boys gone and she going home to sit and listen to a pine tree, see? A nice little front story, see? Front page story. And you just might mention the canned goods I put in the back of the car for her. I'd never seen her before. She'd not come to the trial to see Joe McDevitt lounging like a sleek reddish animal, his veins crammed with healthy life. He hadn't shown much interest in the trial, even when the facts about the bank robbery and the cashier's death were made damningly evident. It was my big first court case since I'd been on the paper. I wasn't asked to cover the hanging this morning. The other court reporter had done that. This business of taking home the mother was almost as bad.
Uh-oh. Over there. Yeah.
Well, this is the Larkins Road, isn't it? I didn't know it was surfaced yet. She said nothing. Every once and so often, she wiped her face with the wad of her handkerchief. I was somehow sure that it was not tears she wiped.
did Jack Kelly think he was gonna get out of sending me home with a lot of canned goods?
I think he was just, I imagine he wanted to show how sorry.
Anytime Jack Kelly spends money, you can bet he knows he's gonna get something for it. I guess maybe he figured you'd write something in the paper about it.
Mrs. McDevitt, I wouldn't write anything you wouldn't want me to write about.
I could tell you something Jack Kelly wouldn't want you to write about. It was the time he tried to do me out of my homestead.
Well, when was that? Tell me about that, won't you?
Well, about 2 years after I come down on my land here, my husband's mother up in Vermont wrote me that my George was awful sick. I'd been working in Miami for Mr. Barnes, waiting on table for the 6 months they let you live off your homestead. And it was time I went back on it. But I got permission from the land agent to leave long enough to go north and look after my children. In Jacksonville, between trains, I met this Jack Kelly. I'd seen him come into the restaurant time and again. At the minute he saw me, he knew I was supposed to be on my land. Well, so McDevitt, so the pine land was too much for you, was it? When you see me going, giving up my pine land, you can have it yourself, Jack Kelly. I thought no more about it. But don't you believe it? That man turned right around, come back to Miami, and filed a counterclaim against my property. Now he thinks he can fool me with canned goods. Jack Kelly.
But he didn't get your land, did he?
No, of course he didn't. The big fool. I had my permission right enough. And the day after he filed the claim, he come down to look at my house. And a good neighbor of mine that seen him coming fired shots in the air, and he said, Jack Kelly ran like hellfire. I don't mean you should write that in the paper, though. No.
I pondered, regretfully, the news value of that story. But she was quite right. I couldn't print it. The paper wouldn't stand for it. And besides, it was libel. We were running past Pineland now. Palmetto fans softened the ground around them. The brilliance of the sun penetrated their endless ranks in a swimming mist of white light. They were like no pine trees I'd ever seen in my life. Their high, bare trunks rose up so near the road that I could smell their resinous breath and see flakes of gold on their scaly bark, red and brown and cream, as if patted on with a thick brush. Their high tops mingled gray-green branches with long needles, twisted and distorted as if by great winds or something stern and implacable in their own natures. They're wonderful, aren't they? The pines? There's something beautiful and fresh about them, different from any trees I've ever seen before.
I remember the first time I come down here 20 years ago. In those days, the nearest road was six miles away. You had to take a horse and carriage from Miami to a place near Gould's where the road branched. Then you'd have to walk across the country to where my land began. The Palmetto was deeper than it is now. But I was younger. Nothing was too much for me. When I walked to a place where the land agent said it would be good for a clearing, I just stood still and listened. you could hear little noises a long ways off, like a bird rustling up on a branch or an insect buzzing. Those trees were the quietest things I ever seen. It did you good just to feel them so quiet, as if you'd come to a place where everything began. I tell you, I just started crying, but not to hurt. I never was one for crying, but this was good, easy tears. You know the way you cry when you're so happy. You can't believe it's true. Yeah.
What made you come down here homesteading in the first place, isn't it, Devitt?
Well, I was in the freeze years ago, up in Orange County, 1894-95. McDevitt bought the orange grove, and we were froze out. McDevitt would have it that we must not sell the oranges until the season was later and the prices better. Mr. Larry, I told him to sell. You see, I just felt it, you see. Fruit was coloring wonderful that winter. In those days in Orange County, the trees were tall on thick trunks. And up in the branches, you could see the oranges in clusters, growing gold color, like there was sun on them. I never saw a fruit like ours that winter. Seems like the branches would break with that fruit. Then came the big freeze. There never was one like it before, and there never has been since. That was about the last difference McDevitt and I had. Oh, he was a smooth, smiling man, hateful, with easy ways, eyes boring in for the weak place in you. Made him furious not finding mine. I'd be stronger than you are, I say to myself, and more of a man. You see if I won't. There was even as soon as after George was born, I'd grit my teeth and bear that look in his eyes until he'd fling off, leave me a week or two for spite. You see, we come down to Orange County from Vermont State, where his mother was. And he got this orange grove with money my mother left me. But I knew he wouldn't be one for holding it, so I held it. That winter, McDevitt had a great orange beard that was the color of oranges. He'd sit around barefoot on the porch of the shack and combed it. Joe was about a year old, yeah. But I'd leave baby Joe, little George, on the mattress in the breezeway between the two rooms of the house and go to work in the grove. He'd sit there, smiling, never sweated. The heat was terrible. That's what made the fruit ripen early. I was wild with nerves about it. But I wouldn't let McDevitt know. Only when he come home from Orlando and said he got an offer to sell the crop on the trees for $10,000. Only he'd decided not to. That night, I thought I'd choke with orange trees. Next day, McDevitt went off somewhere to spite me because I wanted him to sell. I never let on that my knees were like string to see him go. He would have liked me to beg him to take me. He turned at the gate and smiled at me over the orange-colored beard and his eyes like wires boring into me. I shut my mouth tight and let him look. So he stopped smiling, left me there with the 2 children, the 4 workers living down a ways in the shack in the grove. And the days got hotter, and I would have sold the crop, only I couldn't find the man that made the offer.
Did anybody sell?
Everybody in Orlando, at the bank, everywhere said to hold on because the prices were going up. Then one day, it began to get cold. Came on in the morning, by afternoon, it was so cold the children shivered, and I had to put 2, 3 extra shirts on them. In all the groves up and down the road, they began to light fire pots and start bonfires to keep the oranges from feeling it. It kept getting colder. Late that afternoon, I went out, stopped the men from lighting any more fire pots. I could see it wasn't going to do any good. I told them to cut down a couple of old trees, keep themselves warm in their houses that night. Had them bring me some of the wood too. Then it got dark sudden. I gave the children some bread and milk and put them to bed with all the bedclothes over them. I put a shawl over my knees, one around my shoulders, sat close to the stove, fed it with orange wood. All night long I sat there and it kept getting colder. About midnight, I could tell it was freezing outside because the trees began to crack and snap. And then pretty soon you could hear thumps on the ground where the oranges were falling off. Thump, thump. I knew that every cent I had in the world but $2 was being frozen up. Next morning, I looked out on the ground, carloads of oranges were scattered. Crop was ruined. Every orange was hurt. And all the way up into Orlando, and all over Orange County, and all the way up to Jacksonville, it was the same thing. It wasn't just me that was ruined, the whole state was. Well, when McDevitt heard how things were, he told the man that was coming to Orlando to tell me that I could have the grove. He said he was tired of oranges anyway and thought he would go to Texas, and I probably wouldn't see him anymore.
That's hard to believe. A husband would up and leave you like that.
Well, maybe he thought he'd find a weak place in me that way. But you know, he sure did put the ginger in me, made me mad enough to do anything. You see, Mr. Larry, I found out the trees weren't dead. Only the fruit. There was maybe a chance to save next year's bloom. So I went to the bank at Orlando and borrowed some money to keep going on, and almost everybody else that wasn't too discouraged done the same thing. The sap was beginning to come back with the heat. People were getting real cheerful, like people get in fruit country, living on next year's promise. Then another wave of cold came. I sat up all night again. You couldn't hear anything but the crackling, snapping of wood. But you could feel the chill that meant next year's hopes were dying. My fire went out and I felt the freeze in my bones. Even when it come daylight and sun straggled in the window, I was sitting there all bundled up by the cold stove, not daring to go and look until little George woke up and opened the door and told me to look. Oh, you never saw anything like it in your life. The sap had frozen and then split the trees down to the roots. Every tree was killed. And when the sun was hot and the warmth was coming back, all the country smelled of rottenness. It was like death. Business was stopped, all the banks were closed. Then the people began to go away. They could have stood it without money, but they couldn't stand it without the hope of their trees that they worked so hard over. Put the last cent in. They went away from the blackened, rotting groves, and they left their houses wide open. Food on the table, bread in the oven, and in a week, it was like everybody had died. Some went back to places they come from up north or from the old South, and some went to Texas and Oklahoma. But some of the men that didn't have all the spirit taken out of them were talking about going farther south, way down in South Florida, that nobody thought was fit to live in on account of the swamps, down to this new place, Miami on the coast, where they were bringing the railroad. These young men said that maybe there they could start new orange trees. Yeah. And, and there was government money, land you could homestead. And now if I hadn't been so mad with McDevitt, I don't see how I could have done it. But I began to think, if a man could take up a homestead, maybe I could. And then I'd put a grove in and show McDevitt I was a smarter man than he was, even if I was a woman. So I wrote to his mother and told her just how it was. And she wrote back she was sorry McDevitt had been so mean, but she'd take the children for a while. She was a good, kind woman, and I guess McDevitt took after his father. I don't know. There were some people going back to Vermont, State from Orlando, that could take the children to her. So that's how I took up my land. Perhaps I made a mistake. You know, there's plenty of people made good money growing oranges in Orange County since then. Oh, go slow here. We're getting closer.
The sun was beginning to crawl down from its zenith and burning white in the sky and turning a faint flower petal blue. The wind from the invisible sea to eastward came in steady, freshening gusts. There was a straggling of grove of grapefruit at the left, which revealed a road, more like a path. I turned up this in answer to her hand. Beyond a patch of unused, cleared land, the pines began again, larger than any I'd yet seen. Superb trees. They seemed to be the very ancestors and originals of all the others we had passed. The house stood in a small clearing, perhaps the half-acre prescribed by the government for homesteaders. It was made of pine logs, and there was a well beside it, and a small garden. When I stopped the car, I found myself listening intently. It was as she had said. You could hear little noises, faint and far away. She was walking to the house.
You could take those canned goods back to Jack Kelly. Mr. Larry, come and sit down. I'm gonna have me a cup of coffee. You're a right kind man, and it's a long ways back.
I sat on the porch steps, thinking of the pine trees. Their airy quiet was a healing and a blessing. I felt sure that if I could only still myself, hands, eyes, heart, perhaps I would enter into the knowledge of something deep and hidden and wonderful, as if I were standing on the threshold of a slow moment of revelation, a moment for which being had been created. She gave me a cup of coffee, and I took it. You must have had a terrible time clearing all this, Mrs. McDevitt. And living here all by yourself? How'd you ever do it?
Well, I had a 6-shooter. It's wonderful how you toughen up to using a grubbing hole. I grubbed all that out myself. Yes, I did. Yeah. And after I had the men cut the trees, I made them leave all those pine trees. I don't mind being alone here. Got so I didn't like to be anywhere else. Once, when the rains were bad, I waded in from Gould's with water up to my waist and a sack of Irish potatoes on my shoulder. Mr. Barnes didn't want me to go. I was up in Miami waiting on table to make enough money to put grapefruit in. A man come in and said all this part of the country was swept away like it was a cloudburst. I couldn't rest until I came to see. My house hadn't been finished long, but when I got here, sopping wet up to my armpits. This house was all dry, high and dry. You see, this land is higher than anything around here, so I stayed here a week until the water went down. Worked around, lived on Irish potatoes. I was glad to get back here from town. It was getting too crowded, to like it. I wasn't afraid of much by that time, but snakes and McDevitt. Staying out here by myself nights somehow, I got to hating him worse and worse. Well, one morning, just about when my house was finished, I thought I heard McDevitt stumbling around, at the well down there. I don't know what got in me. I was all a tremble. I went to the door, and I fired up in the air over the man I could see down by the well. Well, he kind of crouched down. And when I went over to look, it was this old Negro. Law, Miss Sarah, no man's gonna ever steal up on you in the nighttime. Yeah, he would have run away, but I started laughing. I said, listen, I told him, don't be scared. Don't you be scared. And you come around here anytime you want to. And he did. Always helping me out with something or other. I tell you, Uncle Joseph, we used to call him. He showed me all about sweet potatoes. He helped me put it in a lot just over there where the soil's good. Yeah. And I sold them to Mr. Barnes, you know, in Miami at the restaurant. Then I put in tomatoes for a while and did right well with them. So I didn't have to work in town the 6 months that they allow you off your land. I did all the work myself, so it didn't cost much, no.
The morning and what had happened to Joe McDivitt seemed very far off to me. I thought perhaps it began to seem so to her, too, for suddenly her face wrinkled into a network of silent laughter.
Yeah, talk about funny, though. I have to laugh. Every time I think of it, it shows what a fool I was in those days. And when I made enough money in Miami to get my house built down here, I was crazy to get into it. I wanted my own roof, my own pine trees. Well, it was all done but the front door. And that had to come down from Miami special on a wagon. I had been sleeping over at the Marshes, those good neighbors I told you about. 10 miles up the road, and then I got my furniture in, stove, bedstead, and 2 things McDevitt's mother sent down to me. And I made up my mind I wasn't going to wait any longer for that front door. I was just going to live in my house anyway. Such a fool. So when night came, I put on my 6-shooter with the belt over my nightgown, and I shoved the headboard of the bed right up against the open door. Yeah, it was one of those high wooden headboards, and I went to sleep, slept like a log, not thinking of anything. Well, along about 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, I woke up with a jump and lay there listening to how still it was. And I was thinking how far I was from anything and how dark it was, and me all alone in the middle of it. Well, came over me all of a sudden that anybody could crawl right through that door in the space under the bed. I never thought of that. And while I was lying there thinking that, something screamed way out in the woods. Well, say scared. When that thing screamed, I thought I'd just die right there. Mr. Larry, you could hear wildcats sometimes in those days. Only then, I didn't know what it was. And the next morning, I went over to the Marshes and stayed there until the door got in. And I put 3 bolts on it, and you bet I used them. All of them. But I can laugh over that now anytime I think of it. And 2 days later was the time I shot all the snakes I ever seen around here. There was another funny thing. Can't bear snakes. I was sitting in this chair inside my door back here. The door wide open, and that was before this porch was built. I was sewing, had my 6-shooter in my lap, and all of a sudden, I kind of saw something on the floor out of the tail of my eye. And before I ever turned to see what it was, a cold feeling went all over me. That snake. And before I knew exactly what I was doing, I grabbed my gun and I shot 6 shots at that thing. It was a rattlesnake. As thick as your wrist. Not 2 feet from my foot. Yeah. It was as dead as a piece of string with bullet holes all around it, right in my new floor. Yeah, you can go inside. And you can see where it is right now, because just right in there, you can see it. That afternoon, there was a man here, and he was planting some oranges. I thought I'd see how some orange trees would do here. He says, look, there's a snake. And I turned around, sure enough, there was another one. And I guess maybe 2 snakes in one day. It was too much for me. For everything went black, and I didn't know what I was doing until I could see that man looking and laughing at me because I was killing that snake with a stick. And I was stamping on its head and dancing all over him. And then my 6-shooter bumping on my hip. He says he never saw anything so funny in his life. And I looked, but I don't remember much of it. Anything. I was so blind mad. I always did hate a snake. Yeah.
I found myself thrilling to all this that she had been telling me, as if the courage and trauma had stirred deeply my imagination. She was indeed a better man than McDevitt. She was unique. She was magnificent. I saw what it was really to be a pioneer, a woman, lonely, afraid of snakes, sustained by no dream of empire, but only a 6-shooter and the enduring force of her own will. I felt at once humbled and exalted at this glimpse of the thrust forward of the human spirit. Did you stay here alone always? You were very brave, I think.
Well, I sent for the boys as soon as I could. George was big for his age, and Joe wasn't a baby anymore, no. They come down with some people that were coming to Miami, and I was afraid they wouldn't recognize me. But George said I was taller. I couldn't seem to sleep much that night. I'd have to keep getting up and lighting the lamp to look at them all over again. Sleeping that heavy weight, children have. They looked beautiful. George was black-haired and heavy, like my father, and Joe was kind of gold-colored then, and he used to wrinkle up his nose and laugh right out loud in his sleep. I guess it was pretty lonely here for the boys after a while, because they'd been used to school in Vermont, and there wasn't any school nearer than Coconut Grove. And they were used to playing with other children. And I was busy from daylight to dark. And George liked to help with the tomatoes sometimes. And they liked to roam around in the pine woods. And I gave them the orange trees, but they didn't take care of them. But it didn't take to that much. Anyway, the oranges aren't so good here as in Orange County. I saw that right off. Not good. Times when my tomatoes failed or the crop was short, I could always go over to Gould's or Peter's and work in the tomato packing house. It's easier money than waiting on a table in Miami, I can tell you. And I would walk home at night, and sometimes the boys liked to pack a little when the season was good, and I saved up money for them. I knew they'd have to go to school sometime, but I kind of kept putting it off. And a lot of company and a couple of kids fighting a holler and then yo-hoing around. I get used to baking big batches of bread and pies and having to patch trousers. Besides, I was afraid of McDevitt. Didn't seem any time at all before they were big. Time goes fast down here with the big pine trees. In the winter, the warm dark comes easy, early. And there's maybe some cool nights, and once in 2 or 3 years, maybe a slight touch of frost. In the summer, you could hear the rains come booming and hissing from the sea. Afterward, everything springs up juicy and green. The palmetto blossoms are sweeter than orange bloom. And little yellow and purple wildflowers grow up around the pines. Nights, the mockers would go crazy, and all kinds of little birds that come from hot countries further south sing in the moonlight. Summer and winter smooth into each other, so you don't notice how time goes creeping, except by watching young trees grow taller and boys grow big and try to act like men. Springs, they would get excited to see the fires that start in the dry time, leaping and roaring off the pines. Falls, when the big rains fill up the roads and swales, and they run around splashing in it and having fun. But all the time I knew they ought to be in school. Mr. Larry, the country around here was changing. Yeah. And when they put the railroad through, gangs of men camped out Miami way, not 10 miles from here. And the boys liked to hang around the camps. I was afraid they'd learn things at those camps that wouldn't be good for them. And I guess they did. So I sold some of my land nearest the main highway and sent the boys to Miami, where a woman I knew promised she'd board and room them, darn their socks, look out for them. But they didn't like school so much as they thought they would, and George, crazy to go to work, and I didn't like him too. Didn't feel right, Mr. Larry. All my people in Massachusetts were educated, and I want my boys to have all the learning they could get. Oh, but the next 2 years, my tomato crop failed. Once with too much wet, and then next year with nailhead rust, and I had to get a job cooking for a woman over to Perrine. So George worked a while, and then Joe wanted to go to work too, and they worked around at different things, and I could give up cooking. And next year put in another crop of tomatoes, and that crop was fine. It was a big year, and I got George and Joe to help me picking and carrying to the packing house, and I paid them the same wages as anybody. And it was real nice. They were big, strapping boys then. And it seemed like everything was coming all right at last. We'd go home and light the lamp, and I'd cook them a good hot supper and see them lean over the table and eat hearty. Then McDevitt come back. I could see it just as plain as it was yesterday. After supper, the boys were sitting on the porch with their shoes off and smoking. I came to the door after the dishes were done. And just as I stood there, McDevitt walked out of the dark into the patch of lamplight by the steps. I knew it was him before he looked up at me, smiling with his teeth shining under that long red mustache and his eyes gleaming like hot wires. His beard was gone. He had a good suit of clothes on, white collar. He put his leather bag on the step and stood looking at me, and then at the house, and then at the big boys staring at him. Well, Sarah McDivitt, I see you done pretty well here. Don't you dare set foot on this porch, Peter McDivitt, or I'll shoot out my gun at you. This is my land and my house, and I got made free dealer right and proper under Florida law, so you couldn't get any of it. And you could just go back the way you came. He stood there and looked at me with his nose coming down over his mustache and the veins standing out on his forehead. He'd taken off his hat, and I could see he was older and than he used to be, and not so smooth, because now he could cover up how mad he was. But he stood still in his tracks. You know, the way a tomcat stands that hasn't made up his mind how to jump. He looked at the boys standing there with their mouths open, then looked back at me, a hateful, sliding sort of look. If he'd been a snake, I couldn't hate him worse. Well, Sarah, you know, yeah, I guess I can see. You know how to take care of yourself, all right? But it's a long ways back to Miami. And I haven't seen my boys since they was little. And any father has the right to talk to his own children. You haven't got the heart to keep me from doing that in a minute, have you? I had, though, and I would have if I could. But when he smiled at me like that, I knew I couldn't do any more with him. And what I had, I slammed the door and walked up and down the kitchen, trying not to listen to the sound of their man voices, talking easy on the porch, trying to hear what they said, trying to make myself think I don't care, that it would be all right as long as he couldn't get my property away from me. And I remember I stood at the sink wiping the same clean plate over and over again until I couldn't stand it any longer. And when I opened the door again, the two boys were standing out with McDevitt, just their feet in the patch of light from the door. And he was talking to them, and they were laughing, and pretty soon he went away, and George carried his bag for him. And they must have stood a while talking down by the gate. For the boys didn't come back for a while. It seemed like hours. And when they did come back, they walked and acted real careless. You know how they joking, caulking, loud, cutting up with each other. And when they stood at the foot of the steps and looked up at me, standing stiff in the doorway, their eyes were shining and hard, and they wouldn't quite look at me. The way men folk act, you know, when they think they're woman folk are standing in their way. I see that McDevitt had turned their minds away from me a little, so that there was something hard and cold come between them and me. After they went to bed, I heard them talking low. Yeah. They were laughing, sometimes joking. Next day, they said they wanted to go to Miami. I gave them some money and let them go. I couldn't have said anything to them against it, any more than I could have begged McDevitt come back that time. I felt as if something inside me was a hard lump. It wouldn't let me feel anything. It was just as it used to be when he tried to find out if I had a weak place he could get a hold of. I grit my teeth to keep from showing it to the boys. They didn't come back for 2 days. I didn't expect them to. Now, I had a couple of men working for me then. I had them cut down all the orange trees and drag them to a cleared place at the end of my land and burn them. Fire showed red through the pine trees. That night, the boys came back as if nothing had happened. Walking up the path with McDevitt walking between them. I told you once. I'll tell you again, Peter McDevitt, I won't have you on my place. The boys can do what they like. They're old enough to know better. But you, I don't have to have, and I won't have, and you can make up your mind to it. George put his arm around me. Oh, Ma, Grandma McDevitt used to say you were too hard. Dad never did as much harm to you as you thought. Joe and I think that you ought to let him come in and talk things over with you. He's had a hard time too, and it would be nice to let bygones be bygones. I looked down at Joe, standing tall beside McDevitt, looking at me. McDevitt smiled, as if at last he found the place where I was weak, and I knew it. Then, I don't know what I was doing, except I heard somebody telling them they can all three go away and never let me see him again as long as they'd rather have him than me. I saw them hurrying down the road, all of them. And I ran in and got my 6-shooter and ran down the path after them, shooting over their heads. I threw that gun away. I went stumbling in the dark after them down through the pine woods where there was a reddish light from the bonfire still flickering. At the gate, I saw McDevitt go on down to the car he had there, but Joe turned down. He started back at me, and George stopped, and then he began to walk toward me, and I felt that hard thing in me was melting, softening. I could see Joe's face and George's so clear, without any kind of dark mist over them. It seemed to me that it really didn't matter how weak anybody thought I was. As long as I had my boys, I started to walk to them too, almost crying, and I was just going to beg them to come back anyway when Henry Marsh drove up, leaned out, and shouted at me that the orange tree fire had caught, and it was threatening the rest of my pines, and on his side, clear up to his grapefruit grove. I didn't understand him at first until he kept saying that the fire was creeping toward the pines, and I looked, and sure enough, all that light wasn't just the bonfire, but the palmetto flaring up and popping and flying, the flames climbing like ragged ribbons all the way up one dead tree that stood near it. If I hadn't been so taken with McDevitt, I would have known the difference long ago. Well, there wasn't anything else to do but go and fight the fire. I guess George and Joe must have turned around and gone back with McDevitt. And I rushed up to the house for some burlap bags. And then Henry Marsh and I, we drove near the fire, as near as we could get. And through the smoke we could see that a big tree that was burning fell like a fiery flag, falling straight toward the finest stand of trees between there and my house. I just went crazy. Would I been with snakes or with McDevitt wasn't anything to that. I was so scared the pines would go. Henry Marsh said I snatched a wet burlap out of his hand, went at that burning tree single-handed, stamping with my shoes in the flying embers, until he said it was a miracle. I didn't catch fire myself. But all I remember was the heat on my face and the kind of wildness in me to get that fire out, no matter what happened or what the cost. Finally, when that tree was out, they got me back to my house, fixed up my burned hands, legs, feet. I slept that night as if I was dead. Next day, I sent word to George and Joe that they could come back and see me when they wanted to, but I never said anything about McDevitt. And although they came back sometimes, it wasn't any use. I guess I knew it all along. Something had changed in them. McDevitt hung around Miami, and I knew the boys saw him and were with him, although he never tried to come out here himself again. He never came himself. That night finished something for me. I knew I'd never dared to say his name to them again or ask them what they were doing. I never did. They got jobs in town, I guess, and when they come to see me, I was glad to see them, but I never treated them like I'd used to, and they didn't. And they weren't the same with me either. They brought me money sometimes. I'd never take it, and I wouldn't ask them how they got it, although they seemed to have plenty, dressed real nice. But I guess things, they got to act out more like McDevitt smiled, like he did, not move their heads when they looked at things. Only their eyes talked smooth and shifty, and sometimes they'd come back and stay a while, and all that would slip off of them. They'd be like my boys again, Mr. Larry. Well, anyway, I'd go back, and they'd sleep. I'd go in nice. When they were asleep, I'd look at them. Great, long, heavy boys, the black one and the red one sprawled over the bed. I never let the boys or McDevitt see that I had a weak place. Never once. I never let them see me cry. I didn't cry. McDevitt went away finally, and I guess maybe he got driven out of town, and the things that happened.
There was a man coming up the roadway to the house. I stood and watched him come. I was glad I would not have to say anything now. As he came up the steps, I saw that he fumbled with his hat. Evening, Mrs. Marsh, Mrs. McDivitt. Ms. Marsh wanted I should step over and see if you need anything, or if you wouldn't like to sleep to our house tonight.
Well, you're right, good neighbor. Henry Marsh, tell Lizzie I don't want anything. Thank you. And I wouldn't be comfortable anywhere else but here. I think you know that. And I want to be up early in the morning. There's a man coming with some avocado seeds. I thought I'd see how they do here. This young man is going back now. Maybe he'd give you a ride as far as his house. I'm much obliged to you, I'm sure.
Driving back along the dark road, I spoke only occasionally to the thin man who seemed much affected. I told myself it was ridiculous to be affected so much, and yet I could not forget her sitting there on that dark porch. I'd seen no sign of defeat or despair, only hope in tomorrow's avocado seedlings. I was leaving with what I found splendid in her, a spirit which, by repeated and hard-won victories, had strengthened itself, had learned to do without all the ordinary happinesses. She had maintained herself like an old pine through many burnings by the enduring soundness of its own wood. That, I saw, was my story. If I could put into words so important and so abiding a thing.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you.